Hello and welcome to this Mythconceptions video from NET English. Now today we're going to focus on the poem My Last Duchess by Robert Browning and this idea that the Duchess in the poem was unfaithful. Now as ever with these videos, we're going to take this idea and test the extent to which it is correct. So basically try and conclude, is it right, is it wrong, or is it partially right or wrong? Now today's mythconception is some sort of variation on this idea, and you do come across this quite a lot, that in My Last Duchess, the Duchess has been unfaithful to the Duke, and that is the reason why he has her killed. Now off the back of that, we're also going to try and test this idea that the Duke had the Duchess killed, and question the extent to which that actually is a valid interpretation. So what are the arguments for? Why might we think that the Duchess in the poem has been unfaithful? Well, one key point that the Duke calls attention to is that she's flattered by the attention of other men. So when the painter, for example, Frau Pandolf, comments that her mantle laps over my lady's wrist too much, it calls up that spot of joy. So basically she seems pleased, flattered, mildly embarrassed. She blushes because the painter draws attention to a part of her body, her wrist. It also refers in the poem to the faint half flush that dies along her throat, and again it seems that she's blushing at the painter's attention. There's a second reference to that spot of joy, and the very fact that phrase, that spot of joy, appears twice in the poem suggests this is a real focus for the Duke. The fact that she is blushing, she seems pleased by the attention, and then the word blush is used. So she does seem flattered from the Duke's point of view by the attention of other men. There's actually the implication from the Duke that the Duchess has a wandering eye. So the comment, for example, that she liked whatever she looked on and her looks went everywhere, could be interpreted as the idea that she looks at other men, and that her looks are, finding them attractive, that she's attracted to these other men that she looks at. In fact, the Duke seems jealous of the fact that she treats him just like other men. She ranked my gift, for example, with anybody's gift, he says. Or he asks the question, who passed without much the same smile. So she accepts gifts from her husband and gifts from other men and treats them the same. She smiles at her husband, she smiles at other men. So the idea that on some level she isn't keeping her attention for her husband, and possibly a vague implication somewhere in there of infidelity. The real focus of the Duke seems to be on her naivety, the idea that she is easily led, perhaps easily corrupted is an implication. Such stuff was courtesy, she thought, he says. She had a heart, how shall I say, too soon made glad. And the quotation that she was too easily impressed. The idea that she's perhaps been led astray by other people because of her naivety, because of her innocence. There are a couple of references in the poem that perhaps could be linked to some vague suggestion of actual infidelity. And I have put a question mark on the screen deliberately because they are very, very vague. For one, there is this reference to the bough of cherries some officious fool broke in the orchard for her. Now, cherries are frequently linked as an image to the idea of virginity, to sexuality. So the idea that perhaps he's implying that there's some suggestion of infidelity with whoever this officious fool is, perhaps even in the orchard, who knows. And this idea also, she thanked men good, but thanked somehow, I know not how. And maybe this suspicion, this suggestion that perhaps she has been thanking men in ways that are inappropriate to her station, and again, perhaps a vague suggestion of infidelity. So that's the arguments for the Duchess being unfaithful. What are the arguments for the Duchess not being unfaithful in the poem? Well, the single biggest argument against the Duchess's infidelity is the fact that it's never mentioned in the poem. There is no mention of the Duchess doing anything with anybody, and certainly not physical infidelity. What we do see in the poem is the Duke's absolute focus on control and ownership. From the very beginning of the poem, for example, with this reference to the idea that none puts by the curtain I've drawn for you but I. The Duke is obsessed about controlling his wife, controlling access to his wife. He's far more bothered about other people viewing his wife and her being flattered than about anything actually physically happening involving his wife. Even the Duke accepts that his wife was being polite. So this reference to such stuff was courtesy, she thought. That essentially she thinks other people are being polite to her, and she therefore in return offers the approving speech. She thanked men, good. What she's doing is what she's socially supposed to do, thanking people for what they have given her. Fundamentally, what the Duke dislikes is that his wife looked at other things, at other people, and found joy in them, found pleasure in them. And what the Duke fundamentally dislikes is that his wife was happy. This reference to the spot of joy comes up twice. The fact that she was made glad, that she was impressed, that she liked the approving speech, and that all smiles stopped. What the Duke really wants to control is his wife's emotional state. He wants to basically stop her being happy in terms of anything else apart from him. So the real conflict in the poem is between the Duke's materialistic arrogance and the Duchess's valuing of natural beauty and of human kindness. This is not a poem about the Duke actually thinking his wife has been physically unfaithful. It's the social and emotional aspects, the possessiveness, really, that he's focusing on. So where does this leave us with our mythconceptions? Well, the key mythconception today, that the Duchess has been unfaithful to the Duke, and that that's why he's had her killed, it simply doesn't really make sense in terms of the poem. There's nothing in the text that suggests she's been directly unfaithful. There's perhaps suggestions that the Duke thinks she's been emotionally or socially unfaithful in the sense of looking at other men or being entertained by other men finding her attractive. But there's nothing in the text that suggests she's actually done anything that justifies her death. Now, the second part of this, that the Duke had the Duchess killed, well, this rests on this key quotation from the text, "This grew, I gave commands, and all smiles stopped together." Well, it's pretty clear in the text that the Duchess is dead. She's referred to as his last Duchess. There's a dowry mentioned, which suggests that the Duke is he's getting remarried. Now, based on that, this link between "this grew, I gave commands, all smiles stopped," and the remarriage does strongly imply that he had her murdered. The very fact that all smiles stopped, this absolute cessation of everything, all happiness in her life, would lead us to infer that it's linked to the commands that he gave, and therefore she's probably been put to death. Obviously, off the back of that, we'd assume, therefore, the Duke was probably responsible. I gave commands. That leads to the smile stopping. He feels no remorse. That's clear throughout the poem. And actually, even in death, he treats his wife as a possession. That's My Last Duchess, he says, referring to the painting of his dead wife. I call that piece a wonder. So he's far more impressed and far more interested in the painting than in his wife when she was alive. And the reference to the fact that none puts by the curtain I've drawn for you but I shows the absolute control he has over his objectified wife in her death in a way that he didn't have when she was alive. Now, the reason it is a question is there is a potential alternative interpretation. And that's the idea that it could be interpreted, this idea that her smiles will stop together, as meaning that actually what happened was that she was banished. Now, in the time the poem is said, so we're talking essentially Renaissance Italy, it was reasonably common for wives who were out of favour with their husbands to be sent to a nunnery to live and to be secluded there. It's also possible that the wives who were out of favour could be confined or imprisoned on their husband's estate. And if wives were viewed as being unfaithful or under suspicion, that again was a fairly common thing. So actually the death we could be talking about here is not simply a physical death, although we assume that has happened because otherwise the Duke couldn't be getting remarried, but certainly an emotional or a social death, and that's what the Duke has enforced upon his wife. Now, it is worth just finishing off by talking a little bit about the context of the poem. Now, at the start of the poem, Browning gives us this reference to Ferrara. Now, Ferrara points us towards this couple on the screen. We have Alfonso II, who was Duke of Ferrara, and we have his wife, Lucretia de' Medici, who was, of course, Duchess of Ferrara. Now, Browning's taken a real historical story, and he's used the bare bones of it to create this narrative we get in the poem. To be very, very clear, Browning's poem doesn't give us an accurate representation of what happened as far as we can tell. It plays around with the facts to give us a better narrative. Now, what did happen was that in 1558, Alfonso II, who was Duke of Ferrara, married Lucretia de' Medici. Now, he was about 20, she was about 14. Only 3 years later, so 3 years after marrying Alfonso, Lucretia de' Medici died. Now, Lucretia was famous for being quite quiet and quite pious in terms of her nature. So, quite unusually, I think, in terms of the time, and certainly atypically for the families from which these two people came. There are no references, contemporary references certainly, to any scandals, any intrigue, no references to lovers that she may have had, or any kind of misbehaviour, no scandals. Now, her death was actually blamed at the time on tuberculosis, which was quite a common diagnosis for deaths at the time, especially among the young. But there were rumours that circulated that Alfonso had had his wife poisoned. And certainly towards the end of their marriage, the two were living apart. Now, again, there's no suggestions in any of the historical sources, as far as I know and as far as I think as we can tell, of any kind of infidelity on her part. But there is a very, very strong bit of evidence that she failed to produce an heir, which would be an expectation in terms of marriage. He would expect his wife to give him a child, and she didn't. And also, Alfonso was known for being very proud and very difficult in his personal dealings. And those things together, I think, prompted people to circulate these rumours that he had had his wife killed. So there we have it. So today's misconception, this idea that the Duchess had been unfaithful in the poem, doesn't really make sense. Obviously, the Duke in the poem is presented as someone controlling, as someone dominating, but his concerns in the poem really are far more about his wife's emotional infidelity as he sees it than any kind of suggestion of physical infidelity. And also the history behind the poem, the context around the Duke of Ferrara, Alfonso II, and his wife, does give us this little bit of another angle, potentially, that can be usefully explored. Hopefully that's been useful. Hopefully that's clarify things for you. But as ever, do remember the best thing you can do is to test out ideas, explore them, bounce them around, and draw your own conclusions. Thank you for your attention, and I'll see you in the next one of these that we do.